If you'd rather I didn't bury the lead, then the summary here is, I don't want politics in video games, and similar phrases can refer to a number of ways that political things manifest in and around games. The steady increase in dismissals of this sentiment, especially through dead-end assertions of prejudice, only guarantees negative outcomes for those doing the dismissing, whether they're a company or an individual. For more detail, watch on, and thank you. Following my previous video, I felt like expanding a little, particularly with respect to the no politics in video games idea, which tends to pop up in the discourse. That phrase, and similar variations, despite being quite bland, can be incendiary now. Naturally, part of it comes down to what a person chooses to think they're hearing by comparison to the actual intention of the speaker, although I've just described about 80% of the issue in general communication right there. Regardless, the sentiment I have increasingly seen, as you might have, is that to say anything along the lines of "I don't want politics in video games" is a dog whistle. That is to say, what it really means is, I don't want to see gay people, women, or non-white people in video games. To begin, there is the assumption here that the person saying this is presumably not gay, a woman, non-white, or some combination thereof. Well, if you know nothing about the person saying it, that may be unwise. You might be surprised how many members of those demographics really do mean the original sentence. As an aside here, I think any number of propagandists would have loved the term dog whistle. If a big part of propaganda is to convey the opponent as powerful and fear-inspiring, while simultaneously being weak and contemptible, try some of the Games Are Dead articles and see what you find in that respect, then the powerful aspect may be lacking here, but the implication of the targets being weak dogs listening for their master's command to heal comes through with aplomb. Saying that, if you've ever had a big dog barrel down on you with no idea if it's friendly, then perhaps the power aspect isn't lacking at all. To the point, with as big as gaming has become, there is certainly probability that a few individuals who really do mean that exclusionary interpretation of no politics exist. If they were, as it seems weird to believe, the majority, then the popularity of various games, protagonists and assorted characters of all kinds is paradoxical. Naturally, bringing up this discrepancy can result in a routine that an Olympic gymnast would envy. This would be the "you only like the female character in good game X because she's attractive" kind of response, that makes it seem like the only real rule is there are nothing but exceptions to the rule. There is another fly in the ointment here though, because you will hear people who make this no politics statement appreciate games with themes that do tie back to politics. What is being expressed then? I think it's fairly simple. The thing most customers want is that you do whatever you're trying to do well. You could absolutely make a game full of gay women of assorted races, body types, and you know what, let's abandon that example because there's an extremely easy way you could make that very popular quickly. That's not an implication about typical male preferences, incidentally. I invite you to look into the demographic compositions of various gacha games, among other things. The point is, you can make a game with any mix of the aforementioned demographics and even political ideas, so long as it's not so ham-fisted that it could be turned into a 3-course meal. Perhaps the more important thing is that if you're working on an existing property, you keep things contiguous with what came before. If you don't, you'd better come up with a hell of a reason. The muddying of this topic, whether you believe it intentional or not, was aptly summarised in a thought I encountered recently. The writer's observation was that in the discussion of politics in games, the person you're talking to could be describing one of a few different things. It could be a more philosophical aspect, that is, the broader idea and concepts in a game's narrative, or things like the way its world is established and the interplay between characters. Their examples were of the ideas brought up in the Metal Gear series and that its world is built on, or by Andrew Ryan and Rapture in BioShock, among others. I think this is the least likely aspect to be the cause of objection because we tend to be interested in explorations and depictions of these things. It can be the case even when that really isn't the primary focus of the game. For example, Red Orchestra 2's voice acting causing discussions amongst players on the nature of war. The actors knocked it out of the park, and it could be quite harrowing. It's a minor thing, and may well not have been intended in this case, yet it caused reflection on the topic for some. I think the core point here is of ideas conveyed intentionally or not through what the game sets up. Next, the object of reference could be of a more direct or current political nature. Think in terms of a video game where the hero or villain might be an orange man who loves walls and coins insulting nicknames for people, or a senile man who speaks gibberish and periodically sniffs children. If the characters are named Tonald Drump and Bo Jiden, then you go from not too subtle to subtle as a brick. A game with a mild or even overt level of direct political application can still absolutely be good, although it's a far trickier line to walk. You go from broad to specific, and so you're in a narrower space. This type of explicit political injection is liable to tire even a supportive audience, if for no other reason than generally a person playing a game is not looking for a declarative politics lesson or playable opinion piece. Less space in that sense tends to mean less room for the interesting reflection I mentioned. It's where things like this come in that you start to see the objections being made, especially where it's obvious the political aspect has been inserted with a crowbar. We return to the need to do something well. Alternatively, the description could be of external readings from a political or ideological point of view. This is especially true where these things are nowhere in the game's world and would be completely alien. I don't know whether you could say it elicits more objection than the previous aspect, but it definitely does generate objection. This was one of the issues mentioned in the previous video on the part of the established gaming press. I'm sure many remember when games were under attack from fundamentalist Christian views on games, both in terms of their content and their nature as a medium. The worlds of Pokemon or Harry Potter are not Christian ones, or for the sake of thoroughness they aren't obviously or explicitly so. Christ does not resurrect Harry and smite Voldemort, nor does he find Professor Oak possessed by Legion, drive it into 2,000 Snorlaxes, and have them drown themselves in the sea. A Christian reading can be done, but an attempt to impose that framework on games universally is going to get you pushback. Similarly, any number of games do not occur in an American political, Marxist, intersectionalist, I didn't stutter, corporatist, or whatever the hell lens you wear context. You can read them in those contexts, as many of the gaming press writers have chosen to, and we've seen the result. This is where the trouble really emerges. What if an organisation works to impose a framework on games? This is another aspect of the objection I've added beyond the original writer's idea. Now, you aren't dealing with a few games here and there that have organically chosen to use direct political issues as a foundation or part of their game and its world, nor are you dealing with external readings applying their framework to games that they have no business being applied to, which might be daft but doesn't change the game. Now you have an external entity approaching a game and its world and levering things in with whatever political ideological bent it may have. The game previously might have been significantly different, had a more coherent world or better written characters for instance. Whatever might have been, it isn't now through external input. The problem you have then is with association. If a company is known for a political or ideological styling and they're associated with a game, well then you can be forgiven for presuming that the game will contain aspects of that styling and might well be the worse for it. Perhaps a more pertinent point is that it may also be predictable. Whatever it does, in whatever way, may well have the colour of that ideology or those politics. That becomes boring, not a word you want to hear in tandem with game. The substance of the dog whistle comment provides the clue about the ideology under the spotlight here. That is the intersectional framework or some derivative of it. But you could substitute almost anything ideological really. If every game contained varying levels of shoehorned elements of whatever type, you'd be likely to get sick of it. Bowser declaring the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat. Snake opining that all taxation is theft and declaring himself sovereign. Bayonetta earnestly proclaiming Christ is king, and that one would be something. Or Bourbon explaining to Artyom that if you just make corporations with enough power and wealth it'll fix everything. Another one that would be hilarious in its incongruence in context. Take any one of those sentiments and imagine it cropping up in every one of those games and every other one besides. Good? I suspect not. Thus, when someone's sentiment is "I don't want politics in video games," we've seen a conflation of what is meant. If you're cynical, that's entirely intentional to poison the conversation. If you're not, then it's happened organically, but frankly it still poisons the conversation. There's the dog whistle interpretation, just not liking direct politics in games even when intended from the off, not liking political discourses around games, and not liking politically oriented adjustment of games when in development. That's the bare minimum, because lest we forget, there are a bunch of people who might say this because their feeling is something like, I care but I want to play, not deal with it here, to I don't care about it and it's boring, to you literally cannot influence me because I let my dog decide what I do, so you're wasting your time. There are a wealth of reasons someone might be averse. The dog whistle interpretation and response is a convenient way to avoid the constructive interrogation of the why. Why, specifically, doesn't someone want politics in video games? Do they mean at all, or just some kinds, or just in some ways? Another explanation for the interpretation is that it's not about avoiding that interrogation, it's because the person responding to the objection doesn't care why it's been made. That one sort of sits alongside the possibility that they also just genuinely believe all objections to politics in games do equate to no gays, etc. This is the root of the point. Dismissal of the objection to politics in games as mere revelation of dislike for given demographics, for whatever reason it's done, has no positive outcome, unless we consider not having to engage in further discourse a win. This seems obvious to me, but to state it, you aren't going to know why people are objecting. When you're hearing this objection from people who plainly can and do appreciate some level of politics turning up in games, and maybe of or appreciate representations of the demographics they're claimed to dislike, then it's something you'd want to know. The simple answer, incidentally, is it's because it's being done badly. You lose out in disregarding your audience and ploughing on, and I'll forgive you if you've just gotten déjà vu. You might think laying all this out is naive or pointless. In the sense that zealots and opportunists have no interest in hearing it, then yes. In the sense that certain businesses have already figured out what's wanted or not and why, and made moves appropriately, then yes. However, contrary discourse is what helps overturn, if not prevent, ideas cementing universally like this. For instance, that anyone objecting to politics in games does so out of hatred for something and so can be ignored. That is patently not the case. On the individual level, the dissension may crack a metaphorical door open. On the business level, it may lead to less crappy products. The individual's voice matters. There's a reason everyone wants all the 5-star reviews and scrambles to avoid the 1-stars. It's a reason the dismissal I've brought up is sought after. A way to cut that voice out, which ultimately won't help a business financially, but will help dim any inclination to speak or find out what's really going on for customer and business respectively. That's why it's worth speaking, and as accurately as you can, even if the result is a ban, which is a favourite tactic we've seen over the years. In any case, I'm straying now, and I think the point's been made, so I will leave it there. Cheers.